How did Major General Vandergrift defend the most important terrain in Guadalcanal? This is the Battle of Henderson Field.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
This episode, number 148, is the 14th in our series with Dave Holland, the author of Guadalcanal's Longest Fight, the pivotal battles of the Matanical Front. This is the fourth in our series looking at the Battle of Henderson Field. We've discussed the Japanese plans for their offensive, we've looked at the American defensive plans, and we've also looked at the diversionary battle across the Matanical. Today we're discussing the main attacks that occurred south of Henderson Field from the October 24th through to the 26th. Let's get right back into it with our discussion with Dave Holland. So it's been raining. The Japanese troops have been on the Murayama Road for days and days now. It's been hot. There's been lots of rain. They've been carrying large loads. The rain clears and they are finally about to put in their assault. Do you want to talk us through how that plays out?
Yeah, so the first element, like I said, Tsuji now is in charge of the 230th. They were supposed to hit on the right-hand side, and the 29th was supposed to go basically attack parallel. Two regiments with two battalions in front and one battalion in the rear as a reserve. Typical Japanese attacking columns. Yeah, that's what they're going to do. So they're attacking columns. Each column of battalions. And generally what would happen, the first battalion would move up and try to find the weak spot in the enemy line. The other two battalions would attack right and left and go around. That's how they worked. And Americans knew about how the Japanese tactics were these supporting columns. They knew about that from fighting them already. So they had plans for that. So the Japanese sent the reconnaissance guys up. One battalion of the 230th managed to get across the open field. They were actually following the track. They went to Briggs Outpost. So I'll take it a step back. Briggs had seen them coming. And if you ever see the HBO Pacific series, it was a good part in there when Briggs is on the field phone talking to Puller. He's whispering, the Japs are here. And he goes, how many? The whole effing Jap army. And he goes, that many. And he says, go to the right. I'll give you 10 minutes to go to the right and come in through the army lines. You just imagine these poor Marines with Briggs and his men. They've just watched basically a whole battalion, at least the Japanese, past them. They're given 10 minutes in pitch black darkness to move toward American lines, pass all these Japanese, go into American line on the field phone line because Puller was running an open line so everyone can hear. The Americans are expecting the Japanese to come at any time. Imagine these poor Marines. Because what happened to those guys, most of those guys went straight to ground somewhere and just hid out. And on that, the 46-man, there was only, I think, they lost three. One came back 2 weeks later. But yeah, they've only lost three. But yeah, the Japanese are moving up. And they didn't know, even though they had the reconnaissance guys out, if you read the reports to the Americans, the Japanese didn't even know they were moving in to the American lines. The first Americans at Coffin Corner, machine gunner, sees a column of Japanese walking down the track. He said they're smoking cigarettes and talking. Tells me they didn't know the Americans were that close. And he says as soon as I challenged them, he said I seen the cigarettes fly. And then I let loose with my machine gun and killed most of the guys in the first group. So that was the 230th. That initiated it. And then the battalion started attacking and in company-sized strength, just dribs and drabs, piecemeal assault for those two, for the 29th. So the 230th, that stage, had moved out. They're still to the right, out of the fight, a bit lost. It all goes down to just one regiment now. And now that regiment is only two battalions are into attack. And now the two battalions only lead companies are in the attack. And then what they're doing is, because the jungle is so thick, they're starting to channelize them. So they're going down the Sector 3 trail and they're going down the Jeep trail because that jungle is so super thick, you can't get through it. So they're taking a path of least resistance and going straight up the trail, attacking in basically platoon strength at this stage, which is allowing the Americans to potentially take them on and defeat them in detail. So this is basically the whole division attack. It just narrowed down to, at this stage, two companies on the attack. And then it's what the Americans thought they were going to be. If any force came through, they're going to be treated and they're going to be channelized so much, or canalization straight into our defenses. And that's what's happening.
And I think it's very hard to understand the difficulties, like for Briggs trying to get his platoon out and for the Japanese trying to make their advance to contact to the American defences, unless you've actually been trying to walk in the jungle at night, it's very difficult to imagine just how, like all of the noises that you hear, the difficulty in following the person in front of you, even though they might be just 3 meters in front of you, it's so easy to lose them, and then everything breaks down into disorder. It's extremely difficult to do, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you got a thick jungle with the vines. You can't even move 50 men 100 meters because they're going to be so thick, you sort of break them up, much less a battalion. And then, once again, they're going to go to the path of least resistance because the whole Japanese mindset is attack, 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 keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. So they get just like water running down a hill. You take the path of least resistance. There's their tactics. That's what they're going to try to do, try to flank you. Try to find your weak spot by noise and distractions, or get you to fire your guns, take out the machine guns, and hit the weak spot and move through. But they can't find a weak spot here. They can't infiltrate around, so they got to go straight down the path of least resistance where the Marines had it wired in. Because you've got the Sector 3 trail. I'll mention it now. Guarding the middle of that Sector 3 trail was a 37mm anti-tank gun loaded with canister rounds, and you had Sergeant John Basilone with 4 heavy machine guns supporting that 37mm, all covering the Sector 3 trail. It had a gate. It had like a wooden gate covered with barbed wire, and that was the way through that trail. So they're covering that. The Jeep Trail, another path, the avenue of approach, had, at that first night, 2 37mm on both sides, something like 3 50 cals, about 5 or 6 30 cals, all designated on that small area. Then you had barbed wire aprons, a barbed wire. Now, running through the jungle, the Marines had limited field of vision. They had roughly 20 yards to the wire and about 30 yards on the other side. So they had about a 50-yard field of vision. They had cut firing lanes, 75-yard firing lanes, diagonal firing lanes, hoping the Japanese would hit those firing lanes and move through. They had the machine guns locked in, which they did. And then had the barbed wires in zigzag form. But the barbed wire was 4 foot wide and 4 foot high, an apron, like an apron, hoping the Japanese, they were going to hold the Japanese up on that barbed wire and apron long enough to kill them with all the heavy machine gun fire they had. And that was what they were counting on. So we're talking, in that thick jungle, we're talking 50, 60 yards, it pitch black darkness. That's all. And the Japanese run on top of you. They're shooting their final protective fire, basically at that stage, because Japanese are hitting the barbed wire, and all the Americans are firing final protective fire straight down the lines of the barbed wire line to hit the grazing fire to kill all the crawling or the ones bunched up. So that's how close it is. They're all hand grenade range here.
So we've got Shoji on the right wing, probably not really in firm command of the battalions underneath him. At 2200 on that night, Colonel Matsumoto, the operations officer of the 2nd Division, he informs the higher headquarters that the Japanese are now in possession of the airfield.
Yeah, so that's another good one too. Now, I was speaking to my late friend John Ennis, and me and him had a good discussion one time. And all the histories you read and all their accounts, unless you read some of the Japanese accounts, so this supports it. So basically said, yeah, it was a mistake. Because you got to remember, the combined fleet is setting up to the north from 3 elements, ready to go, ready to draw the Americans out in the fight of the Southeast naval battle, plus 2 to send a group to Henderson Field to occupy it. So they're just waiting on this code word. The code word was going to be, it's pretty original for the Japanese, Banzai. And that was the code word. And if the code word Banzai came out, that was the trigger to start to release these first elements of the combined fleet. That meant they've taken the airfield. So most accounts you read, they just said, it was the Japanese made a mistake. I don't know what they were thinking. But unless you really start to delve down into the campaign and know what the Americans had on the bowling alley at the time, they were building an emergency airstrip. It was called the secret airstrip. That's why you won't find it in a lot of accounts. In fact, they had, I think, 6 or 7 CBs, naval construction guys, working with the Army. So if you read some of the Army accounts, a new Army book, they said they had the CBs would sleep with the Army at night, but they'd leave. They had a roller, like a construction, had a bulldozer and a roller and stuff. They had this partially completed airfield. So in the first elements, this one major of the 230th ran across hit the airfield, this emergency airfield, this bowling alley. He goes, oh, shit, I'm on the airfield. This is it, because they don't know exactly where they are. They know there's an airfield there. Pitch black, you can see the confusion. So he sends a report straight back to division headquarters. He goes, hey, I'm on the airfield. We're in the airfield. And the Americans, the way I read the reports, is the Americans are defending it very heavily on the other side. Well, of course they are. That's the American trench line, or the bunker line. These Americans are fighting fiercely on the other side, but we're holding this side of the airfield. Yeah, they were, because they built the airfield and basically in front of the American line. In fact, the Americans was starting to build a bit of defenses on the other side in anticipation for that thing to be because the Japanese had jumped in those foxholes. But yeah, and then that went back, and it was actually sent out to Rabaul, and Rabaul sent it to the fleet and goes, hey, banzai. So they sent their first element with the destroyers and some of the airfield battalion. There's an airfield infantry battalion and some airfield elements. We're going to take it. So they sent them, they started south toward Guadalcanal. And then I think 2 hours later, the report came, no, we're false. We're not on the airfield. And then it went back all the way combined fleet, and said, no, that's been a false report. It was reported falsely. So yeah, you won't find that in any other sources, but that makes perfectly a lot of sense once you know about that, quote, secret dispersal airfield that Geiger was building, that General Geiger had built there. In fact, those CBs, I was reading an Army account, Lieutenant Down, he says, we put them in action. We gave them a 5-minute lesson on how to fire the M1 Garand, and we, they're in there in the trenches, listening to bunkers, firing away. So yeah, it's very interesting. You could see how that report was sent back.
So as opposed to the right wing, Nassau and the left wing, they definitely find the American defences and they definitely penetrate. Do you want to talk us through their assault?
Yeah, so that goes back to the 20th Regiment I was talking about before. They're attacking in Piecemeal. They got smashed at Sector 3 Trail. They got smashed at Coffin Corner. So the colonel of the 29th, when it was getting toward daylight, he said, well, we can probably potentially push through. So he took his Color Guard company, which was the 7th Company, and there was another assault by another company, and they got smashed. But at the same time, the colonel and his about 100 guys with the Color Guard, managed to penetrate through right before it got daybreak. So they've penetrated through. They're in about 150 yards in the American lines. They overran 2 machine gun positions, American machine gun positions. And they had a little salient, a small salient, about 100 yards behind American lines when daybreak came. So a report came back to Murayama. They said, look, we're not as successful as we thought we were going to be, but the colonel and over 100 men have penetrated, so they need support. So the next night, they were going to go in and support. And that was a report they sent back to Hagataki. He goes, well, we haven't went all the way to the airfield, but we've penetrated a lot, and we've got a good foothold in the American lines, and we'll probably do it tonight with the rest of we'll use the 16th Regiment or Reserve Regiment, and we'll go help. Well, what's the colonel's name? Starts with F. We'll help the colonel of the 29th and his men who are bravely holding on. So when daylight came the next day, you mean talk about the 3rd and the 164th, how they reinforced the Marines?
Yeah, absolutely, because I think this is it's a smart way of reinforcing a critical part of the battlefield with effectively, they were National Guard troops, weren't they?
Yeah,
First time in combat. Yeah,
the 164th was North Dakota National Guard guys. Well, they had some draftees in there from around the country, but primarily North Dakota. They call them the big raw bone farm boys from the Dakotas. So they put them on the flank, the eastern flank around Alligator Creek and up to Coffin Corner to tie in with the Marines, thinking, okay, this is a nursery sector, so to speak, unless we don't expect an attack here. So they were dug in those bunkers. The 3rd Battalion, so the 1st and 2nd Battalions on the line, the 3rd Battalion of the 164th was near Henderson Field. That was the only really reserve the division had. So when the first report started coming in that, hey, the Japanese are hitting us, and we found the Sendai, we know where they are now, they're hitting us from the south, they made a decision automatically. They told Lieutenant Colonel Hall, battalion commander, get you guys going and start moving up to the ridge, Edson's Ridge, to reinforce the Marines. So Hall went ahead with his, I think, operations officer to meet Puller to try to arrange how they're going to do it. Captain Kelly's up on the ridge with his composite company. So he says, the only way we're going to do it is just integrate these Marines, because this is the middle of the fight. We're talking, they got 1 o'clock in the morning, they got the warning order to move, so they're on the way up. So the middle of the massive fight, you can't move a unit out, move a whole nother unit in. It's basically, the only way we're going to do this is drop them in with the Marines. Just drop them in with the Marines. That's the way we're going to do it. So how can we do it? Because it's real thick. And Kelly came up with a good idea. He goes, well, I've got a composite company for men from every company. So they know exactly where their companies are. So he picked guides from every company. And when the soldiers came up, so they'd meet a Marine guide from, say, Alpha A company. And what they did was L Company was going to leave like A Company, and M was going to this company. And, each company was just going to the Marine counterpart company. They were guided in. So that's how they did it. They just moved them in by hand, and they literally walked down, and if there was no hose, with Marines in hose, they'd drop an Army in the hole, or they'd 1 or 2 Marines in the hole, they'd drop 1 or 2 Army guys in the hole. And that's how they did it. They just interspersed them in. And the firepower increased dramatically because, one, the Army had the M1 Garands, which, the semi-automatic rifles. And Kelly was up on Edson's Ridge, and he could hear hundreds of yards to his left where all the fighting was going on in the jungle flat. He said the tempo increased dramatically. And even the Japanese reports, I think one of the last attacks said the Americans, the firepower increased dramatically. We're getting hit hard here. And that's how they did it. And I remember when Lieutenant Colonel Hall seen Puller basically told him, he goes, look, I don't know who's in charge, who's senior here, but he goes, I know what's going on, so I'm going to be running the show right now. And Hall just goes, yeah, no problem.
Well, the other thing I think is really important is that Hall allowed his unit to be broken up piecemeal and literally 2 of his soldiers to be put with 2 Marines. That's the worst. As a CO of a battalion, that would be the last thing that you would ever want. However, the fact that the Japanese thought that there was a significant increase in the tempo of the fighting, and the Americans were able to generate that increase in the rate of fire with troops that were National Guard who'd never been in combat before, I think that's a really smart use of that battalion.
Oh, yeah, because once again, they've never been in combat before, but they're just getting these, especially 1-7, which one of the best battalions Marines had, veterans, had been there and fought many fights. So they just go, just follow what these Marines are doing. Jump in there. And plus, one, they had the benefit of a defensive position. So they wasn't on the offense, and we'll see when they go to Coley Point a bit later how they stumbled on the offense, because once they put them in the defensive positions, they go, get in this hole, there's a machine gun, just fire to your front or fire to the flanks or whatever. Watch what these Marines are doing. So they were boasted by that. They got in position about 3 a.m. So the last Japanese attack was about 6. So they had enough there to get to, when they lost some casualties, they had some good defenses, and they were able to contribute quite a bit. And we'll see the next night, they contribute quite a bit, a whole lot.
How about John Basilone? Because this is the night that he's doing his good work, isn't it?
Yeah, and like I said earlier, his guns were defending that Sector 3 trail with the 37mm. Now, I've made a whole podcast just on the Basilone incident. And there's a lot of misinformation out there. Obviously, he's a legend, and sometimes legends, their exploits get, and I wouldn't say embellished or blown out of proportion a bit. And not saying that Basilone didn't deserve the medal. Of course he did. He quite amazing, but people just like to, every time a story is retold, just add a little more to it, But yeah, Basilone, he was there. He had 2 bunkers. Each bunker is about 30 yards away. He had 2 machine guns in his left bunker. He was with those machine guns, and there was 2 machine guns in the right bunker. So Basilone actually heard on the field phone line Briggs saying they're coming. So he was waiting. And then they hit A Company to the left first. So his gun started throwing some supporting fire there. And then probably about an hour later, a runner came over and said, look, our bunker to the right's been taken out. So he goes, oh, okay. So he grabs a gun with a tripod on it, low-mounted tripod. He didn't grab it from the hip and fire it from the hip. That's another fallacy. He's grabbed the low-mounted tripod and took 3 guys with him as they head over to the bunker. So when he gets there, all the dead and wounded had been moved out, and there was only 2 Marines left firing. They're firing their rifles. And he sets his gun down that he brought over. He was told the other gun was busted, he said. So he rolls over in the bunker and checks out. One gun is gone, but the other gun just had a ruptured shell stuck in the chamber. So he said he took less than half a minute to free that. So what he would do, he had both those guns. He would load them and fire both guns at the same time. He'd fire one, roll over, load, fire, roll over, and he kept firing back and forth. So they kept stopping the Japanese. The Japanese are attacking, like I said, platoon size at this stage. So during the fight, what Basilone did, he was running short of ammunition. I think they lost 2 more guys wounded. He'd run short of ammunition. And he goes, well, I'll go back to get some ammunition. And he's left. There was 2 guys with him at that stage. So this was an amazing thing. What Basilone did, instead of going straight back 150 yards, he knew the some Japanese had infiltrated around him. He runs out to the front at the barbed wire line and runs down the barbed wire line in front of all the American bunkers and goes back into the line to find a better place in. So that was quite amazing. He makes it back, gets the ammunition, gets a 100-pound ammunition box of linked ammunition in a box. And he said he would, when he get to the clearings, he would push the box over the clearing by crawling, and then he'd get to the jungle, he'd run with it. He was barefooted at the time, and people People go, that's bullshit. He wasn't barefooted. And the way he was, if you ever go in that area and to sort of Solomon Islands, they run barefoot in there, and you got them slick boots the Marines had, that thick, slick clay type terrain he was running with the mud that night. Yeah, of course he would throw his boondockers off, they call the shoes, and run barefoot. But anyway, he's made it back to the bunker, and they replenished the rounds, and he started firing again. And during the time when he'd be firing it, every once in a while, he took his 45 and laid it on the ground, a pistol, and he said that they would yell out, Japanese behind you, and he'd turn around and shoot a Japanese if they were infiltrated behind. And so he started about 12, and they ended about 6. He thought there was going to be one massive Japanese assault about 6, but he said he didn't. But he said they wouldn't attack in continuous. They'd attack in 1 minute, be 30 minutes of fighting, then it may be 30 or 40 minutes, nothing happened, then another 30 minutes of fighting. It was just dribs and drabs, he said, in Piecemeal. He said he didn't know what the score was. He caught it. He didn't know if the airfield had been overran. Once again, they're going back to the Marine tactics. They've been told, stay in your fighting positions. Don't move. The guys behind you will clean up the Japanese and infiltrate. Just keep fighting no matter what, which really countered the Japanese tactics. But Basilone, once again, he had a 37 millimeter anti-tank gun, which you won't hear in a lot of accounts, only 50 yards away. So they're firing the whole time, too. He accounted for 38 bodies in front between him and the wire. And there's a lot of fallacies. Like I said, he didn't run out and move bodies from the wire. He said he moved his gun around when he couldn't get a field of fire, which makes sense for a professional machine gunner. He just moved his gun around. He didn't fire it from the hip. He was on a tripod. He was on a low-mounted tripod. But there's a good photo of 1944. Basilone is actually demonstrating. He's laying on the ground and in a prone position with his 45 beside him. So, but it doesn't look like the great statue of him standing there bare-chested with a gun. I guess him laying in the mud, flat on his belly, would make a good statue. But yeah, but what he's done, they're able to stop the Japanese penetrating from that vital avenue approach. But then after that, after 6 hours, they've moved, and we'll see, the next day, 1-7 is moved up on the ridge, and they didn't participate in any more fighting. It's this whole thing you hear about Basilone was fighting for 2 days and straight, and there's only 2 guys left. There wasn't only 2 guys left. There was 2 guys in his hole, but to his right and left, meters away on both sides were hundreds of Army and Marines. Yeah, it's a lot of, and then you read some stuff that the Basilone's wiped out, personally killed 3,000 Japanese. He was instrumental in wiping out a whole Japanese regiment. But if you know, that's from his Medal of Honor citation. But if you read every one of the Medal of Honor citations from 1-7 that Puller wrote, each one of them had the same thing, that they were responsible for the complete near annihilation of a Japanese regiment, which isn't true. But that's kind of Puller just going, look, that's my unit that wiped out a Japanese regiment. That wasn't true, but that's in every bravery citation for every man in that received a bravery citation in that battalion. So some people read and they just read a citation and without the context and just make up things. And once again, how do you think one man can kill 3,000 Japanese by himself? And hey, anyway.
One thing that really pops out with that story is, so 100 pounds of ammunition, that's 45 kilos. That's a large amount of ammunition to be moving at any one time. On top of that, 45 kilos of ammunition probably wouldn't last that long.
Yeah, they said he had 4 belts per gun. Because I've got his direct testimony. I got 2 of his direct testimonies, and one of them he's getting questioned. He's in September 43. He's getting questioned by 2 Marine officers. And they're really drilling down on the details. And he says, look, I had 4 belts of ammunition left. And one of the Marine officers says, well, if you still have 4 belts left, why did you go back and get ammunition? And I could just see Basilone probably at the time thinking, what a stupid question. And he basically said, well, they still needed to have ammunition by the time it would take me to go back. I'm not going to leave them bone dry. I was using a bit of pre-planning in my head. That I think he had something, he counted 26,000 rounds per gun. Had a whole unit of fire. He said 26,000 rounds per gun. He had 4 guns. So they had a lot of rounds they fired that evening.
He probably would have gone through a few barrels as well.
Well, they're water-cooled. So they're water-cooled Browning. So you hear a thing about another one, they were urinating which isn't true. He didn't say anything about that. Those water-cooled Brownings, like the Vickers or the Maxims, they can run quite a bit without water. I mean, obviously you want water to keep the barrel cool, but it is like firing the air cool, say an M60 or something like that, which you got to, or MG42 or whatever, you got to change barrels. You don't change your barrels on them.
But it also shows just how hectic the combat was, because obviously the company logistics plan has fallen down as well, because there should have been someone coming around saying, here's another 10 belts, here's another 10 belts.
Well, there were guys running around. One of Greer, he was a runner, but he was running up ammunition belts too. But once again, there was just so much ammunition going down. They didn't have that many, and plus they needed trigger pullers too. They wouldn't have that many people running ammunition back and forth.
So the morning of the 25th, how has the American defence held up during the night then?
Yeah, they held up quite well, especially with the implementation of the battalion. Daylight came. One guy said he's seen a whole row of like 200 Japanese in a row just shot down. There were Japanese, hundreds of Japanese all over the place, the bodies. And I'll take it another step back too, what the Marine artillery was doing. I'll talk about these Japanese attacking in columns. They were targeting where they reckoned the columns were coming in. They'd say, okay, here's where the Japanese are hitting us. Let's just fire a few hundred yards behind it and try to strike these columns, which was paying off. I mean, they did it at Edson's Ridge. They struck the columns. And the Japanese had actually, in some of their after-action reports, said, watch it, the Americans would target your columns with artillery and mortar fire. So the day came, there was some Japanese still stuck out in the field between this open field. But what the Japanese had done, they'd pulled back. They'd left their screening forces with some machine gunners and snipers to firing at the American lines and some of the mortar. And during the day, too, the morning time came, the Americans started to beef their lines back up as best they can. They still had these Japanese, 100 Japanese behind the lines. So the most of that morning was spent basically wiping that pocket out. The colonel and a few of his men still survived. They're on the move. But the whole Japanese pocket of 100, 150 men was wiped out. They said, we're taking out and we've reoccupied the line. They started bringing up more ammunition, more guns, like the Coffin Corner. 2 more anti-tank guns were brought in. More machine guns were brought in. They brought up another battalion of Marines, the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, to put behind the line. I think they shifted some of the artillery. The whole artillery battalion was then shifted because they were getting ready for the next night attack. So 1-7, like I said, moved up on the ridge. So they had one company member before the first night. Then the whole battalions moved up there, which left 3 3rd Battalion and 164th. Then they consolidated and they in that line. So now you had an all-army line of the 164th defending that line with the Marine battalion up on Edson's Ridge, which the Japanese were going to attack Edson's Ridge, so they were basically out of the fight. They brought more guns. They started repairing the lines because you can imagine. There was one lieutenant I was reading, he's a machine gun lieutenant in the Army. He's going, well, we had to go out and repair these fence lines because we shot them to hell and back, so that's something you don't think about. And then these Briggs outpost guys, some of them are actually in the field. And the Japanese and Americans, in one stage, just seen these guys waving their hands up. And they go, these Japanese, I don't know if I mentioned the other episode, when the Americans, 164th came over, they had, I think they were either New Zealand or potentially Australian, but they had 16 universal carriers, Bren gun carriers. There's some cool photos of them there. They had the Bren gun carriers, Americans did. And they were using to bring up ammunition and guns and things like that. They use them for reconnaissance purposes too at this stage. But they seen those Americans out there. So there's one American sergeant, he goes, I'm going to go get them. So he puts a machine gun on his Bren gun carrier and he grabs 2 private and they drove out there. And they were picking these Marines up because the Marines read a Marine account. He goes, we're sitting there waving, trying to get the Americans' attention. And this little tank came out. He calls it a little tank. and they rescued, I think they rescued 18 Marines on that day, Briggs and the rest of them. And then that outpost, like I said, there's only, I think there's 2 missing, or 4. There's 4 missing to this day. But the rest of the 42 made it back. Some, I think 2 or 3 came 2 weeks later. But that was what we seen on the 25th. And now the Americans knew that this was the main attack. This is Sendai. Once again, you still had up on Guadalcanal, you still had some Japanese making demonstrations south of Hill 67, where 27 is up on this ridge. So they knew there was a lot of Japanese there too. So they're still maintaining 27 up on that ridge in Guadalcanal, which is 5 miles to the west. So they're expecting a major assault on the night of the 25th.
And the 25th was called Dugout Sunday.
Yeah, during the day, once again, it goes back to the whole Japanese effort to suppress the airfield with this massive amount of airstrikes. And the biggest day of airstrikes they had was the 25th. It was a Sunday, actually, obviously, Dugout Sunday. They call it Dugout Sunday because a massive amount of air. A lot of guys spent time in the air raid shelters, or the dugouts, they called them, that day. So it wasn't targeting the front lines. They were targeting the airfield, trying to suppress it.
And it's interesting because this far into the campaign, the Japanese are able to generate local air superiority and local sea control during the day. So they're able to chase off a couple of American ships that are in the harbour.
Yeah, and it goes back to the massive bombardment and the whole follow-up they basically smashed the Cactus Air Force. Air Force had a little bit, Cactus Air Force had a little bit, but they didn't have much to contest at that stage. Once again, the Japanese came very close of defeating, or not defeating, but this is probably the closest they'll come.
And the failure of this is really about the inability to generate concentration of force. They had more than enough combat power there.
Yeah, and it takes us all the way back to the Battle of Matanical. They've had to disperse their forces to come up with a plan because they couldn't take them out of Matanical. But the night of the 25th and 26th was the largest assault. This was met by the Army on this one. So the Japanese, what they decided to do, they knew, like I said before, Murayama said, well, we've got a penetration already. They don't know at this stage, when the night of the 25th came, that the colonel of the 29th and his guys were basically, they don't have much of a penetration. Most of those guys have been wiped out, but they still thought they had guys there. So what they were going to do is they were going to try to focus where they knew this unit potentially was and send all their guys there to build up, their bridgehead, they called it, whatever in Japanese. So they were going to use Major General Nasu, NASU. He was going to lead the left wing, and it was going to be the 16th Regiment. So a very fresh, brand new regiment. They were going to do a major assault. And the 230th, Soji, was going to assault to the right too. But then Soji started sending reports back during the day and says, we think the Americans are trying to flank me. He goes, what? Miriam goes, what? He goes, I think Americans on the flank trying to flank me. So he goes, okay, you deal with those guys, which there was no one there. He just had reports coming in. So when it get to almost nighttime, Soji's starting to move his forces to attack. But then once night came, he told division commander, he goes, no, I think the Americans are here. So he goes, okay, well, you don't participate in the attack. You defend our right flank against a phantom enemy, basically. So it took that whole regiment out. So now it goes down to the 16th Regiment and the 1 battalion of the 29th that didn't attack the first night. So now they came in massive assaults. Instead of going to Sector 3 trail, everything was going to go straight to the Jeep trail at Coffin Corner. They were going to send everything they got straight to that one little trail and just try to bulldoze their way through. The American put everything they got, and the Americans go fine. The Americans put all their firepower in that little area. The Japanese put all their concentration in that little area. So that's why it led to massive amount of Japanese casualties. And this time the Japanese didn't get any penetration. Because you remember, the Americans had beefed their lines up significantly during the day, and they just died in droves at Coffin Corner. And it was either a soldier or Marine. He came up with the name. He said, if I was a coffin maker, I'd make a fortune here. And they're literally, the Japanese are dying in rows of 200 at a time, straight down the fence line or the barbed wire line. And then the artillery was smashing them. So I don't know how many, they did some like 6 major assaults and all fell to nothing. At one stage, it brought up a whole machine gun company, and they had about, I think, 300 or 400 rounds apiece. And preceding one of their assaults, machine gun company got up there, I think they had 6 or 7 guns, something like that, and they just fired everything they could with a few mortars to try to put the Americans down. Then after that, they all jumped up and joined the assault. And they all just got wiped out too. Nassau was an older general, Major General Nassau. He was basically almost crippled from the long march there. He had a white cane. And he says, I'll lead this assault. And Murayama says, well, you don't need to lead the assault. What are you doing? He goes, no, I'm a come from a samurai tradition. I'm going to lead the assault. Okay. So he did. He led the assault. He was last seen going forward. Well, not last seen. He had his white cane. He said, let's go. And they charged across the field. He got shot down, took a bullet in his chest. They managed to get him back to the division command post, and there he died at the division command post. So he was shot down. In fact, I thought he was the first Japanese general to die in combat, but there was another one somewhere post December the 7th. But he was one of the highest ranking, especially one of the first ones, Major General, to die in combat in the Japanese Army. In Guadalcanal now, but in the whole campaign or Pacific War.
So for those defensive fires on the night of the 25th, how much of it was artillery and how much of it was machine guns that was denying the Japanese the ability to penetrate the defensive lines?
Well, they were hitting the Japanese columns with the artillery, but then once they reached the field, they couldn't drop the artillery because it's too close to lines. But we're talking barbed wire lines about 70 yards away, and it was open field at Coffin Corner. They had to run across roughly 150, 200 yards of open terrain, and they were hitting them with mortar fire at the rear of the, say, 200 yards away. But then as soon as they get close, they got to the barbed wire line about 70 yards away. Then it opened up with canister rounds. And there's something like 4,000 rounds of 37 millimeter canisters were fired that night. And each round held about, 120 30 caliber buckshot size steel balls fired in giant shotguns in a concentrated area. And they had 50 cal. At one point, they had like 5 50 cal machine guns in less than 100 yards and 4 37 millimeters and something like 6 30 cal machine guns. It's just unfathomable the amount of firepower in that one small area the Japanese were trying to penetrate. It was literally a wall of steel. They couldn't get past it.
And I think for those that have never heard a 50 cal fire, it's an intimidating weapon. And to
especially when it's 4 or 5 guys in one hit.
Exactly. Like each round's got a significant amount of kinetic energy. There's a large amount of rounds coming out of the 50 cal. And when you've got 5 of them in 100 yards, that's a significant defensive position.
And with the 30 cals, and then with the four 37 millimeter anti-tank guns firing those giant canister rounds. And every time they'd go boom, one Army guy wrote in his diary, said it was such a sound of confidence when those things would go off, boom, and you hear them. You guys know, he said every time you go off, boom, sound of confidence, you'd know it'd be killing 50, 60 Japanese, be going down. Oh, well, yeah. It's point blank range. It was just hard it's just hard to comprehend.
So how long did the Japanese persist in those attacks against such a strong defensive position?
Throughout the night. Once again, just like the preceding night, it wasn't in one massive assault. It didn't like you'd picture 200 men running or 500 men running in a mass wave. They're pitch black dark, and they're running in, I'd say, platoon and company strength. It just seems like the company was a more organic unit. I guess in those thick terrain, that a company could probably stay together. And then in the thick jungle, a platoon would probably stick together. It'd be like one platoon or 2 platoons would assault, and they'd get wiped out. And then they'd regather, regroup. The next little wave of 1 or 2 platoons would run up.
Now, this was Lieutenant Colonel Hall and the 164th Regiment. They were performing the majority of the fighting on this night, weren't they?
Yeah, Colonel Moore was the regimental commander. Colonel Hall was the battalion commander of the 3rd Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Hall. So, yeah, they were doing all the fighting that night. It was an all-Army show. In fact, that's another of misinformation or misconception that the Battle of Henderson Field, at that stage, the majority of the fighting, the most killing, was done by the U.S. Army on that second night. I think the next day or 2 days later, they reported, the 164th reported burying 975 Japanese bodies just along their lines alone. There were hundreds more in the jungle.
One of the things I find interesting is that we've got Shoji defending against an imaginary assault. Yeah. You don't often see a lack of offensive spirit in Japanese units. Is this really the fact that they are starting to their moral center of gravity is just weakening to the point where they're culminating now? The inability just to continue that offensive spirit?
It might be with Shoji. I mean, the 230th was a real good regiment. They were part of the 38th Division. They were the victors of Hong Kong. In fact, they said the 230th was specialized in taking airfields very well. And they took Hong Kong, then they took, I think, Ambien. I think they went to Timor, too, 230. Definitely with the 38th. They took, I knew they fought the Australians. So I think Shoji, first day in command, when I said the 230th, there was 2 battalions of the 230th and 1 battalion of the 124th, Kawaguchi's old unit. It might be, Shoji, it wasn't his first time in combat. He commanded the regiment in Hong Kong. So I don't think it was because he was, quote, a new commander and he was hesitant. I don't know what it was. I think because they thought that the Americans generally was going to hit them on the flank and they were hesitant of attacking. So he didn't want to get smashed in the rear. He was waiting for the Americans to hit them. Then obviously Japanese doctrine and do a quick counterattack, but that never came to fruition.
Now, this wasn't the only combat that was occurring on the night of the 25th, 26th as well, because we see Oka's regiment finally getting ready to attack.
Yeah, so Oka's finally got in position, but once again, he had 3 battalions. The night before, they'd done a small penetration and overran a Marine outpost, and they couldn't follow through because of the deep ravines there, especially between 49 and a hill of 49 and 67. So they attacked against 2-7, and there were only 1 battalion was in position to attack. That was the 3rd Battalion of the 4th Regiment. I'm going to have that on loan. And when they attacked, they had a small knoll that they went up. And once again, they could attack They attacked in columns of company. First company went over, basically got hit pretty hard, pulled back. The second company attacked straight after them and managed to push through the American lines. They overran a Marine company. Marine company pulled back, and they were on the verge of taking the forward command post. And then their third company was coming up, but then a pretty switched-on Marine company commander. I think the FO, forward observer for 81s, had been killed. He's grabbed the radio and started calling in artillery or 81 millimeter fire, and basically just cut off that third company from supporting the second. So they were left. So he only attacked one battalion. That's when you have Mitchell Page, another platoon sergeant, machine gun platoon sergeant Mitchell Page, and he's up on that ridge. He's basically defending the ridge by himself. Well, that knoll, not the ridge. There's a knoll there. His two sections, roughly about 16 guys, were overran, killed and wounded, and he was running from machine gun to machine gun. And they beat off the first wave, but that second wave overran his position. Then he turned the gun around backwards and was firing at the Japanese between him and the forward command post. And then a guy called Major Connolly, which is Battalion XO, he had a small group of guys holding them off. So he's formed a bit of because Page is smashing from the rear. So he's grabbed a small headquarters staff unit, and they did a counterattack to push the Japanese back down. And then Page and some guys in G Company joined in and with a machine gun. And Page was firing a machine gun from the hill. Then they pushed down. But Page was awarded a Medal of Honor for his actions there. To me, in my opinion, the most amazing Medal of Honor action in the land Medal of Honor action in the campaign was what Page did on that ridge. He was literally by himself. But yeah, that stopped Oka's attack, and that's it. Bang. Another unsupported, the third element unsupported. Once again, out of 3 battalions, you only got 1 battalion to assault. And out of 3 companies in a battalion, only 2 companies were able to assault. So it's a story, the whole Japanese story.
And that is that critical component. If they'd been able to improve the cooperation just between battalions, it's falling down at quite a low level, isn't it? Where you've only got individual companies going into combat piecemeal. Do you think it would have made much difference if there'd been better coordination at the battalion and regimental level for the Japanese?
I mean, you could have had great coordination, but at the end of the day, you're still battling that terrain. I mean, you could coordinate to have all 3, say, companies or all 3 battalions online ready to go. You tell them to go forward, and you got 1 company on the left, got to go down a steep ravine. Company on the right can't go down the ravine and you only got the company in the middle can go forward. Okay, well, we'll send a company forward, the other 2 go behind them. So you're just like a big line of, you're just constricting your troops. The terrain is channelizing them, and that's what's happened. They can't beat that terrain. And plus, obviously, then you add uncoordinated attacks, uncoordination and communication, and then that just adds to it. But if they had an open, flat field, potentially they could have done a lot better, but you're trying to fight the terrain of Guadalcanal.
So what did the Marines and the Army learn from the Battle of Henderson Field?
Well, once again, it boosted their confidence. This was the best one of the best divisions Japanese had in their arsenal. And it was the largest attack because at that stage, the Marines' morale was starting to go down from sickness and fatigue, and they'd been pounded quite hard, and they knew there was at least 20,000 fresh Japanese on the island, and they wanted to take it back. So it really boosted the Marines' morale in this victory because once the Japanese, after that last attack, they did a couple other little attacks. The next night, they did another limited attack to try to recover the colors behind the line. But they're the only 2 nights of determined assaults. The other 2 nights, they were still fighting, but that was mainly just some stragglers and trying to return the colors to get the colors. But yeah, the Marines and Americans, the real morale booster. They said, ooh, we can possibly win now. To me, this was the turning point on land. We'll see in November, you got the turning point we'll see with the naval battles of Guadalcanal. For me, this was it. The Japanese had made their biggest attack, and the Americans defeated them. And that will draw us up into the next stage where potentially got a whole division spread out in the jungle. It's time to go on a counterattack. But yeah, and I think the tactical lessons they learned, I don't know. I mean, much tactical lessons other than defense or confidence in defenses will hold up. Once again, I think it boosted the morale, especially the Army. The Army's there, and the Army can fight. That was another thing. The Marines said, the Army's here. They can't fight their National Guard guys. But after that, they started calling the 164th Marines. And Puller said, these farm boys can fight. He said it over radio. or field phone line. And it really boosted the morale of those guys too. And it's like, okay, well, the Army can fight. And it really paved the way for the Army to come in.
Particularly if you've got someone like Chesty Puller giving such high praise.
Yeah. And 164th, that stage, they're part of the Marical Division, but they were attached to all accounts, they were attached to the 1st Marine Division. That was their direct command. So the 1st Marine Division at that stage had 4 regiments, 4 infantry regiments.
How about for the Japanese? What have they learnt, and where does this leave them and their plans for Guadalcanal?
Well, the Japanese, once again, they never gave up until 1st of January. They said, okay, this has been a minor setback, because the Battle of Santa Cruz Island, which is the major carrier battle, it was fought, when I said the combined fleet, they're trying to draw the American fleet out. This is fought on the 27th, I think 27, 28. Don't quote me on that. I think it's 27th, Battle of Santa Cruz. The Japanese lost more pilots there than they did in Midway. But it was a tactical victory for the Japanese. Pyrrhic, but a tactical victory. And that word got back to the Japanese High Command, Hakataki. We won a major sea battle. Okay, had a slight, they called it a slight reversal. We didn't achieve what we wanted to, but we know that the Imperial High Command is now building airfields in Upper Solomons. Won't be long before we get hundreds of airplanes, and we're able to defeat the American air power. And once we defeat the American air power, we've got 2 more divisions going to be coming in, and we'll just reassume the assault. So on paper, they were good. We'll see probably in the next episode that in reality they weren't so great how they were physically. But Hakataki and the rest of them was like, yeah, okay, we've had a minor setback. We'll continue. We'll do another assault, and this time it'll be a bigger assault. And we'll do it mid-November. And we'll see. They're getting ready for another major assault in mid-November. They're bringing a whole division and a half down of fresh troops. They wasn't giving up.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. A pivotal battle with a lot of lessons to be learnt around... I'll go through and work it all out. But yeah, there's a lot of lessons to be learnt. So thank you very much.
Yeah, once again, I think the Battle of Henderson Field is, to me, the apex of the campaign with the naval and air and sea, land. But it goes always back to the 3rd Battle of Guadalcanal and how important that was. Hence, one of the reasons for my book. But yeah, I enjoy talking about that one. So there's a lot to learn. A lot of stuff happened in this battle. So yeah. Well, I'm anticipating next week, because we'll see how the Americans take advantage of how the Japanese situation is, especially the whole division. Remember, you got a whole division spread out in the jungle to the south. Now, can we cut this division off? If we can cut this division off from its supply line and its trailhead, we'll end the campaign. So that leads us to the next episode, to the 4th Battle of Guadalcanal.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James.
Once again, Dave has done an amazing job of talking us through the Guadalcanal campaign, today looking at the Battle of Henderson Field. From my point of view, there are 3 things that stand out. The IJA's cult of the offensive, or the attack spirit that underlied everything that they did not work very well against a combined arms defense. I think it's important to understand why this kind of thinking persisted despite the disastrous outcomes from the cult of offensive in the First World War. Why was their offensive doctrine important to the Japanese? Firstly, it was seen as not a method, but actually the offense as a part of morality. Failure can be explained as insufficient spirit, not flawed planning. Secondly, initiative was a fundamental part of military culture within the Japanese army. It was expected at all levels, even though, particularly at the lower levels, sometimes it wasn't that well directed. There often wasn't a clear end state. And as we've discussed previously, with the concept of kokokuju, often there wasn't clear boundaries as to how far it could go. Sometimes sacrifice was seen to be a measure of the effectiveness of an attack, rather than the actual outcomes of the attack itself. Lastly, and I think that this is a really important component of it, spiritual power was the strength that would cover material weakness. Japan, an island nation, not well endowed with many of the resources that are required for a militaristic nation, didn't have the capability to manufacture tanks and artillery and ammunition in the quantities required for the desired end state that they had. So they wanted to cover that weakness with an offensive nature for the army. This worked relatively well in the Russo-Japanese War, and it worked extremely well in the early Japanese offences of the Second World War. However, in some respects, I think Guadalcanal can be seen as the inflection point. This is where they are coming up against United States Marines. They are well versed in combined arms doctrine, and they have the capability to create the combined arms effect. The Battle of Henderson Field occurs in October 1942. They've effectively only been fighting for 11 months. The implication of these lessons, though, are something that the Japanese army really struggles to come to terms with. The first night of the Japanese attack on Henderson Field, they do penetrate the American defensive line. They do have some success. However, it is not enough for them to be able to seize the airfield. The Japanese conduct of the battle was plagued with an inability to get cooperation. There was little cooperation between battalions attacking together. There was little cooperation between the main assault and the diversionary assault. And there was little cooperation between the Navy and the Army. Dave's done a great job of putting us in the shoes not only of the defenders, but also of the attackers. If you close your eyes and imagine that you are commanding a Japanese company, a Japanese battalion, or even a regiment in that assault, I can't help but think that you don't have a really clear picture of what it is that the elements on both of your flanks are trying to do and what your part is in this great assault. For me, there's a really big question about the communications capability within the Imperial Japanese Army. I just don't think it was anywhere near good enough. We see the Marines really exploiting their interior lines of communication. Interior lines of communication make it easier not only to supply the troops in contact, not only to move troops around the perimeter defence, but also to communicate. That communication leads to better situational awareness, which leads to better decision making. And we're not seeing great decisions being made by the Japanese as they conduct their assault. The third point, looking at the 164th Regiment as it deploys into combat for the first time. The 164th, a regiment within the Americal Division, the only American division that doesn't have a number. Its name is a compound word based on where it was formed. It was an American division formed in New Caledonia. The 164th, which is a North Dakota National Guard regiment, was the first US Army regiment to fight against the Japanese. The regiments had about 6 months on New Caledonia. We're not too sure how much of it was training. We think that their basic weapon skills were quite good, but they are still green troops. They've never actually seen combat yet. On the first night of the Battle of Henderson Field, they were in reserve. It is pouring with rain. The night is very dark, and they are called forward. So they make a 1 mile march up to the battle. No one wants to see their unit employed piecemeal into a battle and to see it broken up. And so Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hall, he's the commander of the 3rd Battalion, 164th. This is exactly what he allows to do. Because of the fact that the battle is incredibly fierce, there is a lot of confusion going on. So individual squads are led down by a guide to the foxhole that they're going to be fighting in. The soldiers and Marines fight together, and I think that this is a really great way of employing green troops for the first time. They're there fighting with Marines who this is certainly not their first battle. We often see new units into an AO being given quiet parts of the sector to man so that they can shake out and get used to combat. They don't have this luxury. They're surrounded by experienced troops. They can see how they're fighting. They can see examples of moral courage, and all of this helps to stiffen their resolve during this chaotic fight. Major General Vandergrift was so impressed by the fighting qualities of the soldiers of the 164th that he issued a unit commendation to the regiment for having demonstrated an overwhelming superiority over the enemy. Not only that, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hall, the commander of the 3rd Battalion of the 164th, he was given the Navy Cross, a fairly rare decoration in the United States Army. So that's it. I think a great example of the employment of green troops in combat for the first time. the importance of communication to enable cooperation, and the superiority of combined arms against troops even with incredibly high morale. Next week we're back. We're going to be looking at the action around Coley Point, and we're back to the Matanikau as well for the 4th Battle of the Matanikau.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.